reason that's important is the samurai lived by the code of Bushido, honor. And he was a man of great honor. So Chiune Sugihara, born actually right at the cusp of the century, January the 1st of 1900, was interested in the world. His father wanted him to be a physician, and he obeyed his father's wishes, presented himself as a candidate, and wrote his name and nothing else. So he wasn't accepted. But he went through the route. But Sugihara, the reason we know his name, there's another name which amazingly people don't know, Raoul Wallenberg. It's astonishing how many people have never heard of Wallenberg. Never. But he's one of those characters. So Chiune Sugihara was a senior Japanese official. He was actually an intelligence official and was specialized in German and Russian. And German, okay, I'll wait until more people come. I can start again. Do come in.
Hello.
Ohayo gozaimasu. So have you guys ever heard of Chiune Sugihara? Do you know Japanese?
No.
Do you?
I know him, and I've been to Japan many, many times.
Okay. So I was just beginning to talk about Chiune Sugihara. The reason we talk about Chiune Sugihara is there are many people alive today, probably in the order of 50,000, who would not be alive and on the earth but for Sugihara. So Sugihara was a Japanese samurai. Yeah, but the samurai lived by a code. The key word for a samurai was Bushido, honor. And so these were, it expressed itself in many ways, but he was a Japanese official who served as consul in Lithuania. He was there because it was very important for the Japanese to know when Germany and Russia would go to war. It was expected they would, but the Japanese had many forces tied up in the far east, and they needed to know when they might move those forces because they were also planning war themselves at Pearl Harbor.
He was there.
That's great.
Yeah.
Yes, yes. So there's a famous event that launched World War II in the Pacific. But the Japanese needed to know when they might be able to do that. So Sugihara, who was trained in languages, including German and Russian, was posted in Lithuania, which was in the no man's land between where the Soviets were and where the Germans were. So Poland was split between German and Soviet source. Lithuania was still sort of independent. That's where he was. And he took offense at the way in which Jews were being treated by the Germans. It offended him. He thought this wrong. And so he issued visas to people who came to him in Kaunas, Lithuania. Those visas were life and death, because for all the wickedness and viciousness of, say, the German authorities, or for that matter, the Soviets, little pieces of paper, legal or legalistic pieces of paper, made a difference. So if you were a Jewish person in Poland, and my father was one of those people, and I am here because of Chiune Sugihara. And very interestingly, in November 1999, Chiune Sugihara's son, Hiroki's son, was at a Shabbat dinner at our home in Ottawa, Canada. Really weird. So some 60 years after his father gave my father a visa, the two of us are having a Shabbat meal in my home. And there are even more coincidences, which I'll talk about. So he was a senior Japanese official. He negotiated the sale of a railway in Manchuria from Russia to Japan, and the Japanese were the imperial authorities of Manchuria. He got into a lot of trouble with the Soviets, but he left all that area because he objected to the way in which the Japanese were treating Chinese coolie labor. He said, this is wrong, and I want nothing to do with it, and so he was sent somewhere else. Because of his language skills and his special talent, he was aware and empowered to do things out of Lithuania. The Japanese Foreign Ministry were not interested in providing visas to Jews to transit through Japan to get out. You needed to get out of Eastern Europe. The only way out was to have two documents. One document that declared that you were okay to transit somewhere, and that was Japan in this case. And then you needed, for the Japanese, you also needed an onward destination. Some very, very few places provided refuge and the possibility of landing the United States, Canada. My father was one of 50 rabbinic students allowed to enter Canada between 1938 and 1948. Not very generous. So someone very clever worked out, who was a Dutch diplomat, that all these refugees were eligible for admission to Curaçao, because Curaçao had no border controls. You could just turn up there. You didn't need a stamp or a visa. So therefore, you could say, cleared for admission to Curaçao. It wasn't exactly true, but it wasn't false either. But you needed a place to go to on the way to Curaçao, and nobody went to Curaçao. They ended up in other places. But my father had a visa to go to Canada, but how to get out? You needed the visa from Sugihara. There were other elements involved because so anyway, Sugihara provided something in the order of 5,000 visas to people. It's not clear what the number was, but he was even issuing visas while he was on the train leaving the Kaunas railway station. He worked 18 hours a day. There weren't enough arms to stamp the visas, so the Rosh Yeshiva, the head of the yeshiva of Mir, the Mir Yeshiva, was deputized by him as a deputy consul of Japan, authorized to stamp visas. This was extraordinary and, strictly speaking, not approved by the Japanese Foreign Ministry. And he was punished. Now he's a hero in Japan, and there are streets named after him. But for a very long time he had his pension cut, lost his job, worked as a light bulb salesman in Moscow for many years. But it's the extraordinary act of individual courage and compassion. So Chiune Sugihara is a hero. There is a category of, it sounds very odd, they're called righteous diplomats. There were a number of people, probably numbering about 40, who in one way or the other acted against the instructions of their governments and helped Jews trying to flee oppression wherever it was. But Sugihara was probably the most important. Now, my father was a yeshiva lad in Warsaw. And he came from a small town called Przedborz near Częstochowa in Poland, Commonwealth Poland. And he was in Warsaw when the Germans arrived, had one night under German hospitality, didn't wait around, managed to get out with a number of his comrades. He was a Chabad guy, and went to Lithuania, which at the time was in between the zones. So they remained. He studied in Vilnius, and Kaunas is where Sugihara was. It's one of the people who got a visa. Those who were lucky enough to get Sugihara visas, Russians took over, the Soviets took over, and people left. Sugihara, because he was an intelligence operative, had a variety of different kinds of relations which enabled him, working with the joint, the American joint, to buy at very high prices a passage on the Trans-Siberian Railway. And so they arrived after an adventurous journey over Soviet territory and Siberian territories in Vladivostok, where there were further adventures because all kinds of procedures were needed. So it was a period of high illegality, criminality, but legal forms were observed. That was important. And my father was one of those who was on a ferry that went from Vladivostok to Kobe, Japan. The interesting thing about that voyage is that my father was helped in arriving in Japan with the imperial visa from Sugihara by the Polish ambassador at the time to Japan. His name was Tadeusz Romer. Romer's another famous Polish diplomatic intelligence family. Tadeusz Romer then became foreign minister of the Polish government in exile, then a professor of French at McGill University, where one of his students was my wife, Alti. Tadeusz Romer's daughter married Charles Taylor. Her name was Alba. She died of illness some time ago, but I was very close to Chuck Taylor, who is one of the world's leading philosopher, Charles Taylor, and he was my mentor at McGill. So I spent a lot of time with Chuck and Alba in their home. Alba's father being Tadeusz Romer. We would dance together at Christmas time at Polish agape feasts at the Dominican monastery in Montreal. So he, Romer, the Polish ambassador, brought my father in from Vladivostok, and his granddaughters, Chuck and Alba's daughters, learned Hebrew from wife Alti, and Milu, for example, used the Hebrew she learned from Alti to read Grace at the Vatican with Pope John Paul, and then wrote a postcard in Hebrew with a note from the Pope, all about this. So this is really strange. This 4 generations, all interconnected in ways that you couldn't explain. Whenever there's an opportunity and I'm called on to speak about Sugihara, if physically possible, I do this as a matter of honoring the memory and figure and character and noble deeds of Chiune Sugihara, whom very few people know about. Japan is interesting in so many ways. There are a number of Holocaust museums and programs in Japan. None in Eastern Europe. There are no Holocaust museums as such in Eastern Europe. I think one is now being established in Romania. But the place where these horrible things happened, they're not recorded, but they are in Japan. So what else could I tell you about Sugihara? I'm happy to answer questions, but taking my own family, my father arrived in Montreal, interestingly, when he was on the last boat out of Shanghai. So why Shanghai? The Japanese were preparing Pearl Harbor. So at one point, the Japanese gathered all the expats on the territory of Japan and moved them to Shanghai so that there wouldn't be people running around reporting on activities. And there was a Shanghai, it was not quite a ghetto, but it was a Shanghai area full of these expats. My father was one, Michael Blumenthal, later American Secretary of the Treasury, was another. And at one point, the Japanese official responsible for these foreigners called a meeting and asked the meeting, he said, "We've had a request from our German allies asking us to confine you to an area they call a ghetto and then dispose of you. Before we respond to our German allies in Berlin, may I ask you a question?" So one obscure rabbi from a small town, Ozherov, the Ozherov Rov, picked up his hat and said, "May I respond?" He said, "Please," he says. "The Germans hate us because we are Asians and they are racists." "Ah," said the Japanese, "I've heard enough." Marvelously inspired and not completely incorrect. So my father was on the last boat out of Shanghai before Pearl Harbor. Otherwise, no me, right? He was the last boat out, and the interesting story also is that they crossed the international date line on Yom Kippur, which is a 26-hour fast day. The question then is, what day are you fasting on? So they fasted for 2 days. There was a big debate along the boat. My father arrived in San Francisco, where he was put with his comrades, put into a sealed railway car, which could not be opened until that car arrived in Canada, which is where my father had a visa to, lest anybody get off that train in the United States. So it's sort of a vignette, a little case study of the atmosphere of the period. So when he arrived in Montreal, they established the Lubavitcher yeshivas and institutions and organizations in Canada, which are important institutions today. But all those were the result of Sugihara. And the result of Sugihara's visa is not only me, but my father and mother have something of the order of over 200 projects. So all that is attributable to Sugihara. So there's a personal debt of gratitude, which I need to honor. I'm talking about Sugihara also here because there are a number of people like me, or here because of Sugihara, people who are from Bir Yeshiva. It's a story of East European Jewry. But it also brings to mind another great figure who similarly is not adequately honored, was not in his time, and that figure is Andrei Sheptytsky. So I'd asked who had heard of Chiune Sugihara, so I'm asking who's heard of Andrei Sheptytsky. Andrei Sheptytsky was the Metropolitan of the Ukrainian Catholic Church, or the Greek Catholic Church, who was the prelate, really the most important Catholic between Warsaw and Japan. For 50 years, he was the leader of the church, considered, but this was a time when Ukraine, this is Western Ukraine, which was his territory, his home was in Lviv, and he was the Metropolitan of the church. I'm not an expert on this, and I'm not a spokesperson for the Ukrainian Catholic Church, but they consider themselves to be a universal church, not just a local ethnic church, a universal church. And they're interesting. The UJE and our chair, Jim Temberty, has donated something of the order of $5 million to the Ukrainian Catholic Church. Jim is of Eastern Ukrainian origin and Orthodox, and yet he gives $5 million to the Greek Catholic University in Lviv in order to establish, in part, 3 chairs in Jewish studies. It's the Lord works in mysterious ways. She really does. So the name of that university was established by Sheptytsky, and Sheptytsky saved many Jews, something in the order of, we don't have an exact number, but let's say in the order of 150 young children who were given refuge in Studite monasteries in Ukraine. Every one of the people sheltered by Sheptytsky and his church under direction from him, not one of those was lost, not one of them was kept by the church. So it's an extraordinary story. He himself didn't survive the war. He died in 1944. He was a wealthy individual. He was his extraction was Polish nobility. In spite of that, he threw his lot in with the underlings, who were the Ruthenians or Ukrainians, rather than become a prince of the Polish Roman Catholic Church, for which the Poles never forgave him. His brother was chief of staff of the Polish army. So an interesting story, but he put his lot in with what he thought his people, who happened to be the Ukrainians, and he saw himself as the ethnarch, meaning the Ukrainians did not have any kind of political expression or independence, and he represented that. So he established the Ukrainian Museum of Ethnology, which is in Lviv, or Lvov, or Lviv, or Lemberg. It's one of those cities that has 5 names, Leopolis, and he couldn't buy a building. None of the Ukrainians would sell him a building because they saw him as a Pole, and the Poles were the oppressors. So a Jewish guy had to buy the building, which he gave to Sheptytsky, and that is where the Museum of Ethnology is today. But it tells you something about the intricate, complex interrelations between these peoples. But he had Hebrew. He would, when he arrived in a town in Galicia, the Jews of the community would, as a practice, it was customary, would greet him with a Sefer Torah, and he was considered a leader of the flock. He issued proclamations during the war and preached, "Thou shalt not commit murder." Incidentally, a lot of people think there's a commandment that says, "Thou shalt not kill." There's no such commandment. The commandment is, "Thou shalt not commit murder." But anyway, that is what he preached. And love thy neighbor as thyself. These were not common Gardner observations in World War II, Eastern Europe. Very, very strong terms. He was a ferocious anti-communist, of course. Godless, atheistic communism, which also was an oppressor regime in Ukraine. So one of the reasons this anti-communism led him to welcome the Wehrmacht when they arrived, which is one of the reasons he has a bad reputation, undeserved, among Jews. But he wrote the Pope, demanded strenuous action, saying, bad as the communists were, no comparison with what the Germans are doing. And so there's many, many aspects of the story of Sheptytsky which we should know much more about and appreciate a figure like that much more than we do. Sheptytsky's brother is actually honored by Yad Vashem. Look, it's not up to Yad Vashem or anybody else to declare who is righteous amongst the nations. But I think it's a scandal that Yad Vashem refuses to acknowledge Sheptytsky. They do his brother, but not him. And it's politically complicated. They say, well, if we honor Sheptytsky, might Pius be next? Because he also acted to rescue Jews. Did they do enough? Did they do enough on time? Were their actions also actions which accommodated fascist rule? Complicated, but many people are alive today because of what Sheptytsky did. The people saved by Sheptytsky include, for example, Daniel Rotfeld, Adam Daniel Rotfeld, who was foreign minister of Poland, and one of our gang as well in the Ukrainian Jewish Encounter Initiative. So the extraordinary figure doing remarkable things in extraordinary and challenging times. So that is why I'm thinking of both Andrei Sheptytsky and Sugihara, which is my personal story, in bringing them together. And these are models for all of us about what constitutes heroic action in morally impossible and physically and politically challenging times. And these are names that should be, along with Raoul Wallenberg, for example, celebrated everywhere and certainly in Jewish homes. So I'll just stop here and anybody can comment, ask me questions. But that's why I'm here. I mean, I'm here because of Sugihara. I'm here because I have a moral obligation as well to recognize those who, like Sugihara, now my wife Alti is fond of saying, we call them the only decent people in dark times. That's how we think of them. That's quite wrong. These were not the only decent people who did the right thing. These were reckless, heroic people. Even reckless people, because they risked not only their own lives, they risked the lives often of their family and people of their communities in doing the things they did. What would we do in like circumstances? May we never be tested, but it's a question worth posing to oneself. What would we do when helping others who are probably, as you think of it, doomed anyway? Helping others when you put your own children, your own family at risk in doing so. So those people who did this sort of thing are not the few decent people in dark times. Everybody normally, other than through wicked people, did what you would expect. They looked after themselves and their family and accommodated for every kind of reason, good and bad, to the existing circumstances. The others who acted to rescue Jews were brave, courageous, exceptional, and even reckless. And many of them were not special people. They were very ordinary people, people whom you would not have noticed, people who in ordinary life would not be singled out as special. It's mysterious, but should be acknowledged, celebrated, recognized.
Thank you. How many Japanese are righteous Gentiles?
The phrase, I must never correct, Wolf was much wiser
Yes.
than most and certainly than me, but often people use the expression righteous Gentiles. That is not a correct phrase. It is righteous amongst the nations.
Okay, but you understood me. How
Yes.
many Japanese now?
I don't know. Probably none.
Well,
Maybe-
Sugihara is
Sugihara's one, yeah. Sugihara's one.
But they saved many Jews, the Japanese. Not only these people, they saved other
Yeah,
groups
well,
as
the Japanese were odd. The Japanese, this is caricature maybe,
Yes.
but when the Germans said, as you know, the German messages were very contradictory, right? The Jews are vermin, but they also control the world. Can't be both at once. But the Japanese view was, well, if the Jews are so important and dominant and have capital and access to all that power, maybe we should get along with them. Maybe these are people we
but
should-
you know that in the war
Yes,
of 1904-1905,
the Russo-Japanese War
yeah, Russian-Japanese
Yeah.
war, it was financed
by Schiff,
by Yakov Schiff,
Yakov
who's
Schiff.
done it because of the
pogroms. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah.
Because of the pogroms. This is true. He played a very important role, and that is noted. But
And the Japanese didn't forget.
they didn't forget that. They also thought that Roosevelt's real name was Rosenfeld.
Yes, sure.
So, by and large, they were much more sympathetic and accommodating than people realize. One. Two, the first, when Japan was opened to foreign visitors and foreigners, the first text the church brought in for study in by Japanese students was The Merchant of Venice. So Western church authorities brought a bit of anti-Semitism and negative images of Jews in with them. And that also had an impact on Japanese attitudes. So when the Japanese worked with the white armies in Siberia at the time of the Russian Revolution, they found, for them, the Japanese idea of regicide was the most monstrous crime. So why did people do such horrible, unnatural things? The whites had Protocol of the Elders of Zion, which, as you know, was a Russian forgery, the Tsarist forged document. So the Japanese came back from their cooperation with the whites with copies of the Protocol of the Elders of Zion. And the Japanese military actually opened a Jewish department in 23 or something like this. Not knowing much about the world, but if that's what they were told by the Russians, then they paid attention to it. So the story is a little complicated. The story is a little complicated.
Can you tell us something about Mendel Tokayer and about the community in Quebec, because your father was there?
I don't know much about it. I know the name. And
May I add that the story goes,
Yes.
the story goes, that the Japanese saw that the Russians on their side of Manchuria created a Jewish state, which was Birminghan.
yes,
And they thought that they had to counteract by creating a Jewish state on their side of Manchuria.
I didn't know that.
And
Yes.
it was called fugu. Fugu is the name of a poisonous fish. That
Yes.
if you eat it, you get ill. So it was a poisonous fish for the Russians. Okay? And Mendel Tokayer, the rabbi, he wrote a book about this fugu plan.
The Fugu Plan, yes, the Fugu Plan. So all kinds of ins and outs and footnotes in history which are interesting.
Are there any memoirs by Sugihara? I mean, I'm sort of wondering what was his impulse, given that, frankly, this also put him at risk,
He did.
what he was doing.
And he was punished. The short answer is he didn't write. He never claimed any credit. He was neglected, suffered, and his own view was he did the right. That was what he needed to do. Never claimed
Dismissed
credit.
without attention. That was his.
Yeah, but then one of the descendants of the Mir Yeshiva, made it a major object of his life to find where Sugihara was and recognize him. And he was frustrated by the Japanese Foreign Ministry. There were movies about this. He turned up and they claimed they've never had such a person. This is unknown. But he persisted and eventually tracked Sugihara down. And that is how we know the story of Sugihara. Other than, my father would tell me about it. But it was not abnormal for survivors never to talk about that whole period. So a lot of the history is lost. But that is how, I forget the name of there's a film. One is called Conspiracy of Kindness. Another film put out last year is called Persona Non Grata, major Japanese production, which dramatizes the story of Sugihara. And I think there should be a film about Jaптitsky.
There is.
A proper feature film.
Documentary,
A documentary, but I'm talking about one that has broad distribution.
What
Very
was the
dramatic
name?
figure.
What was the name of so there's Persona Non Grata, and what was the other?
That was done last year. A Japanese made for television, mega buck movie. And the other was called Conspiracy of Kindness. Done by a French Canadian woman, Estelle Vicari. It's all, you can find it on YouTube.
Can you say more about how you wound up having Shabbat with the son?
Well, the Japanese ambassador had a dinner for Hiroki, who was visiting Canada, I guess fundraising. And so present at the dinner were myself, Hiroki's son, Herb Gray, who was the deputy prime minister, whose father spent time in Harbin on the Sino, Japanese border, the Sino-Russian border, so I was asked to speak, and I said, Ambassador, if Hiroki-san and I share something unique in the world, if it hadn't been for Shuri Sugihara, neither of us would be here. But that is how I met him, and that was on a Thursday night, so we reconvened dinner at our home the following day.
I don't know if you know this, there's a whole community of Jews who came from Harbin and Shanghai in San Francisco called B'nai Emunah. Do you know that congregation? And the rabbi just passed away recently. His name, Rabbi. He has a daughter who's also became a rabbi. He has an amazing story about leaving Germany in the 1930s and then going to Paris and being rescued by prostitutes when the parents the Germans cut off all the money from his parents, and he was saved by these women all through the war. And then afterwards, when he came here as a rabbi, he would go and visit women inmates at prisons to sort of give back as pastoral care for them having saved him in Paris during the war.
Not many people survived. But almost every case of survival is miraculous. It would need to be to account for. Your chances of surviving, Tim Snyder calculated the odds at, less than 1%. Much less than 1%. If you were from Ukraine and Belarus. These were the deadliest places in the world to be at the time of World War II.
Not Poland? Not Poland?
Not Poland.
I think 10% at least survived in Poland.
Yeah, not Poland. And Tim thinks it's because it was a state in Poland that played a role in enabling a certain mitigation. He has a theory about the role of the importance of statelessness. Ukraine was stateless. Belarus certainly was. These were the most murderous places on earth. And, you know, the anvil, the crush between Stalin, Hitler, not to make facile comparisons, but deadly.
In that region, the one place that stands out so dramatically is Bulgaria. You know, but that story.
Well, where the king, the king declared these to be Bulgarian citizens and subjects, but that didn't apply to Salonika, where, in other words, the territories controlled by Bulgaria, which are not properly Bulgarian, written off. Everybody there was lost.
Right, but that was really Greece. Right?
Yeah. Well, contested territory.
Well, it was called Thracia, it was Macedonia, actually.
Macedonia, yeah.
10,000 Jews were given away to the Germans because they were not Bulgarian citizens. The rest of Bulgarian, whatever it is, but it isn't just the king.
The head of the church?
It is something else. In Bulgaria, it is absolutely extraordinary. It was the whole Bulgarian people who went out on the streets of Sofia with the patriarch of the Bulgarian church and the speaker of the parliament at the head of the demonstration, and they were demonstrating, we want to preserve, to help our Jews. Don't give them away to the Germans.
Right.
And then the king had to go, was called to Hitler, and Hitler poisoned him, and when he returned, he died. King Boris,
Really?
who is considered to be a saintly figure.
Yeah.
But it was the whole Bulgarian people, which is extraordinary.
Yeah. Incredible. So different responses. It's in an area so close together to have such a wide variety of
Well,
responses.
but it teaches us this also. When you say Holocaust, people immediately, I think, by and large, think, well, I know all about that. You know, Hitler, Nazi, Germany, but in fact, I had a friend, he's no longer with us, alas, Martin Gilbert, the great historian, and he'd just come back from a trip from Ukraine, as it happens, where somewhere in western Ukraine, a newly discovered mass grave of victims in the Red Army who had perished of hunger, I mean, basically done to death. And this mass grave contained many tens of thousands of victims, unknown. And what he said to me was, people think they understand the story and the history and there's nothing more to be learned. It'll only be 50 years from now, he said at the time, that we will begin to have enough granular detail of what happened here and what happened there that will enable us to construct much more of what would be a real history of the period and the time and the place. And I think that's the case. There's a lot that we're learning that was not known. Archives, not always open, but more are open than was the case. So we're learning a great deal. More than we knew.